What would you do if a man in uniform looked straight through you while your body was failing, and an entire neighborhood saw it happen? On August 14, 1947, just after 3:20 p.m., inside the gray medical corridor of Rikers Island, a correctional guard made a decision so small it barely registered in the paperwork. No punch, no curse, just a shake of the head. "Not serious enough," he said, closing the metal clipboard. Bumpy Johnson stood there, fevered ribs bruised from a previous beating, sweat darkening the collar of his prison shirt. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look angry, but Harlem would hear about this by sundown. 2 inmates in line watched. A trustee with a mop slowed his stroke. A nurse avoided eye contact. This wasn't just denial of care, it was public humiliation performed in a place where dignity was already scarce. Word slipped out the way it always did, through visiting rooms, through folded newspapers passed at barbershops, through a woman leaning out a third-floor window on Lenox Avenue whispering they wouldn't let him see a doctor. By 6:00 p.m., the story had crossed 125th Street. By midnight, it had crossed a boundary far more dangerous than prison walls. And here is the part most reports never wrote down. Nothing happened next. No retaliation, no message sent, no warning delivered. Just 3 days added quietly to the calendar. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And while you're listening, tell us in the comments, what time is it where you are and what city are you watching from? Because once humiliation becomes public, history doesn't ask if there will be consequences, only who will end up needing the doctor. The clock did not start with a threat. It started with routine. On August 15, 1947, morning count cleared at 6:02 a.m. The same guard walked the tier, same boots, same keys, same posture. Nothing in his report suggested that a deadline had begun. Yet by breakfast, the machinery was already moving. Bumpy Johnson stayed in his bunk. Fever still there. Pain still there. He folded a newspaper from the day before, not to read it, but to keep his hands busy. He understood something the guard did not. Humiliation only works if the humiliated reacts. Silence, on the other hand, creates space, and space lets other people decide what they're willing to tolerate. That morning, a visitor failed to show up at Rikers Gate C. Not unusual. By noon, a second visit was canceled. By evening, a transport van arrived late, 43 minutes behind schedule. The driver blamed traffic. Traffic always took the blame. By the numbers, none of this mattered. In 1947, Rikers processed more than 1,300 inmate movements per day. Delays were expected, but patterns weren't, and patterns were noticed. Across the river in Harlem, the story continued its quiet travel. Not shouted, not printed, just repeated. A man denied medical care in front of witnesses. A guard who made the call alone. The neighborhood understood hierarchy. It also understood leverage. At 9:14 p.m., in a back room above a closed tailor shop on West 138th Street, 2 men shared coffee that had gone cold. One unfolded a confiscated notebook, the kind used to track deliveries and favors. No names were circled, no orders were spoken. One man simply tapped the date written at the top of the page, 3 days. That was the twist no one expected, not retaliation, but coordination. On day 1, nothing violent was allowed to happen. That rule mattered. Violence would have collapsed the chain too early. Instead, favors slowed. Paperwork sat. A phone rang longer than usual before being answered. Harlem didn't strike. It withheld. Inside the jail, the guard noticed it first in small ways. His usual coffee from a cart near the East River entrance didn't arrive. A fellow officer joked about it. The guard laughed along, but he checked his watch twice. He didn't know why. Statistically, correctional officers at Rikers in the 1940s relied on informal systems, rides, meals, errands. Nearly 30% of daily logistics were unofficial. No one trained them to think of that as vulnerability, but it was. That night, Bumpy finally lay back staring at the ceiling. A trustee passed his cell and slowed just enough to make eye contact. No nod, no signal, just acknowledgement. It was the first human moment since the denial. The guard filed his end-of-day report at 11:47 p.m. Everything looked normal on paper. That's what made it dangerous. Because systems don't collapse when alarms sound. They collapse when everyone decides quietly to stop making them work. By midnight day, 1 was over. 2 days remained. August 16, 1947, Day 2 did not arrive with urgency. It arrived with weight. Inside Rikers, the air felt thicker, not louder, not tense in the obvious way, just slower. Doors closed a half-second later than usual. Keys lingered in locks. The machinery of the place still functioned, but without grace. Bumpy Johnson was finally allowed to sit on the edge of his bunk. A junior nurse passed by mid-morning, paused, then kept walking. She carried a paper cup of coffee untouched, growing cold in her hand. That small hesitation mattered. People were beginning to choose which rules they followed automatically and which ones they questioned. The guard noticed something else. No one asked him for anything. In a place like Rikers, that was abnormal. Guards traded favors constantly. Cigarettes, extra blankets, messages passed along quietly. On average, internal discipline reports from that era show that nearly 60% of compliance came from informal cooperation, not force. Remove that cooperation and authority became brittle. By 11:30 a.m., the guard's name failed to appear on a preferred overtime list. He assumed it was a clerical error. By 2:00 p.m., a routine request for a schedule swap went unanswered. By 4:15, he realized something was wrong, not because he was being punished, but because he was being ignored. That was the twist. Punishment invites defiance. Ignoring someone makes them doubt themselves. Across the river, Harlem was still. No gatherings, no meetings that looked like meetings. Just normal life with tiny adjustments. A driver took a different route. A shopkeeper claimed he was closing early. A phone operator let a call ring until it died. Each decision on its own meant nothing. Together they formed a corridor narrowing toward a single man. At 7:08 p.m., the guard stopped by a corner bar near East 116th Street, the same place he'd gone for years. He ordered his usual. The bartender hesitated, not long, just long enough to be noticed, then said the keg was empty. It wasn't. Two patrons watched in silence. One folded a newspaper slowly, deliberately, as if marking time. No threats were spoken. That was the rule now. Back in his cell, Bumpy received a small mercy, an extra blanket, nothing more, nothing dramatic. But when he looked up, the trustee who delivered it didn't rush away. Their eyes met for half a second. In that glance was restraint and certainty. Bumpy did not smile. He closed his eyes. The guard went home uneasy. His wife asked why he was quiet. He said work was work. But later, as he lay in bed, he counted things favors owed, people he depended on, systems he'd never noticed because they'd always been there. By the end of Day 2, Harlem hadn't struck a single blow, and yet the pressure was undeniable. One day remained. August 17, 1947, Day 3 arrived without announcement. At 6:10 a.m., the guard reported for duty and found his locker jammed. Not broken, just stuck. He tugged once, then harder, until another officer helped him pry it open. Inside, nothing was missing. That was important. Whoever controlled the pressure wanted no accusations, only awareness. By mid-morning, the jail doctor finally reviewed Bumpy Johnson's chart. He did not order treatment. He ordered observation. That word carried weight in places like this. It meant delay with a clean conscience. It meant the system protecting itself. Outside the jail, Harlem had already moved past conscience. A delivery truck scheduled to bring supplies to a clinic on East 102nd Street never arrived. The driver later claimed his route sheet had been altered. Statistically, clinics in New York in the late 1940s relied on private delivery contractors for nearly 4% of daily medical supplies. Miss one delivery and the entire day slipped. At 12:42 p.m., the guard attempted to make a call from a payphone near the ferry terminal. The line went dead. He tried another. Busy signal. A third rang until it stopped. He stood there longer than necessary, holding the receiver, listening to nothing. This was the second twist. The retaliation was no longer aimed at him directly. At 2:05 p.m., 3 miles away, a man collapsed in the stairwell of a tenement near Madison Avenue and 119th Street. He was older, diabetic, known to the neighborhood. A man who needed regular care and couldn't miss it. When someone ran for help, they discovered the clinic was short-staffed, supplies delayed, phones unreliable. By the time an ambulance arrived 18 minutes later than average response time for Harlem in 1947, the situation had worsened. Back at Rikers, the guard felt the shift before he understood it. Other officers avoided him, not rudely, carefully. as if proximity carried risk. He asked one man what was going on. The man shrugged. Nothing, he said. That word again. At 5:30 p.m., the guard finally pushed his way into the infirmary. Not to help Bumpy, to demand clarity. The doctor looked at him tired and said something that landed harder than any threat. You should have thought about the whole chain. That was the moment of realization. The humiliation hadn't triggered revenge. It had triggered redistribution of consequence. When the guard left work that night, Harlem was quiet. No celebration, no signal of victory, just a sense that something irreversible had passed. Somewhere in the city, a man lay in a hospital bed who had never seen Bumpy Johnson, never heard his name spoken aloud, yet his suffering marked the end of the countdown. Bumpy remained in his cell, still untreated, still waiting, but the rule had been written without ink. If you deny care in public, the city will decide where the cost is paid. And once written rules like that don't need to be enforced again. They're remembered. By August 18, 1947, the city understood the rule even if no one could quote it. Morning light touched Harlem Hospital through high windows that had seen decades of waiting. The man who collapsed the day before lay still breathing, measured, watched by a nurse who kept glancing at the clock. His chart showed delays, missed insulin, a gap in intake, small notations that added up to something permanent. In the late 1940s, Harlem Hospital admitted more than 42,000 patients a year. This one would not make headlines. That was the point. The guard learned the news at 8:27 a.m., not from a report, but from a silence. He walked into the break room and conversations ended. A folded newspaper lay on the table, the headline about a city council vote creased and worn as if it had been read too many times without being absorbed. He poured coffee. No one joined him. Pressure without violence requires patience, and patience when shared becomes discipline. At 10:10 a.m., a supervisor pulled him aside, not to reprimand, to advise. The tone was calm, professional, almost kind. The words were careful. Keep your head down. In institutions like this, advice like that usually comes after something goes wrong. This time, it came before anything official could be written. Across the river, the chain continued to reveal itself. A pharmacy on Lenox Avenue opened late. A driver refused overtime. A clerk misplaced a file and didn't rush to find it. In isolation, these were errors. Together, they were a message about cooperation, the invisible currency that kept power operational. Here's the twist that never made it into memoirs. No one asked Bumpy Johnson what he wanted done. That restraint mattered. It meant the response belonged to the community, not the man. And communities remember differently than individuals do. In his cell, Bumpy finally received medical attention, basic, belated, controlled. A thermometer, a glance at his ribs, no apology. The nurse set a paper cup on the ledge and left. Bumpy didn't drink it right away. He listened instead. The tears sounded normal again. That told him everything. Ask yourself this: what scares a system more, an angry man or a patient one with allies? Because by noon, the guard realized the humiliation had changed him. Not publicly, internally. He replayed the moment in the corridor, the clipboard, the witnesses, the way he'd closed the file too quickly. He understood now that authority is not what you enforce, but what others are willing to support. By 3:45 p.m., the man at Harlem Hospital stabilized, not fully recovered, stable enough. The city didn't need more. Consequences had landed where they were meant to, not as punishment but as proof. The guard left his shift early. He walked slower than usual. At a corner he paused, unsure which direction to take, as if routes he'd trusted were no longer reliable. That hesitation, small human, was the third transformation. Power had moved, quietly, permanently. So here's the second question, the one history never answers directly. When the city withdrew its cooperation, did anyone really lose, or did everyone learn? The answer hung in the air, unspoken, as Harlem went back to its business. The chain was complete, not broken, completed. And once a chain is understood, it doesn't need to be pulled again. By the afternoon of August 19, 1947, the city had already moved on. That, more than anything else, confirmed the damage. Power does not announce when it returns to balance. It simply resumes its routines quietly, deliberately, leaving the disrupted party alone with their thoughts. The guard arrived for his shift at Rikers Island at 1:58 p.m., 2 minutes early. He had never done that before. Early arrival was a small gesture, but it revealed something new: caution. He avoided the infirmary corridor. That hallway had become symbolic, even if no one said it out loud. A place where a choice had been made too publicly, too casually. In institutions like Rikers in the 1940s, corridors mattered. They were where inmates were counted, sorted, denied. They were also where witnesses gathered. On average, nearly 70% of formal complaints in New York correctional facilities during that decade came from incidents with multiple observers. Privacy protected authority. Visibility challenged it. The guard understood this now. During count, he paused outside Bumpy Johnson's cell longer than necessary, not to threaten, not to apologize, just to look. Bumpy was sitting upright back against the wall, a folded blanket beside him, untouched food cooling on the tray. He did not meet the guard's eyes. That was deliberate, a final restraint. The twist here was subtle but irreversible. Nothing further needed to happen. The man at Harlem Hospital would recover enough to walk, though not without lasting consequence. His name would never be linked to this chain. That anonymity preserved the rule better than any headline could have. In neighborhoods like Harlem, stories survived because they were incomplete, because they forced listeners to fill in the gaps themselves. At 5:12 p.m., the guard declined an invitation for drinks. At 7:40, he took a longer route home, avoiding familiar corners. At 9:00, he sat at his kitchen table, staring at a coffee cup gone cold, replaying a single moment over and over, the decision to close a file in front of witnesses. Ask yourself, how long does it take to unlearn power? Because what happened next wasn't dramatic, it was behavioral. The guard began approving requests he once dismissed. He learned which moments demanded discretion. He learned that restraint wasn't weakness, it was survival. Inside the jail, word spread without words. Officers adjusted. Nurses lingered half a second longer before turning away. The system adapted not out of fear, but out of memory. By the end of the week, there were no reprisals, no follow-ups, no reminders. That silence was intentional. Reminders cheapen rules. Memory preserves them. Bumpy Johnson would later walk out of Rikers alive. Not triumphant, not vindicated, simply intact. He carried no visible marker of victory, only the knowledge that something had shifted beneath the surface, something that would outlast him. The city did not celebrate. It absorbed the lesson. And absorption in places like Harlem was how unwritten laws became permanent. Years later, no plaque would mark what happened in August 1947. No report would summarize it cleanly. No file would connect the denial of medical care at Rikers Island to a delayed ambulance in Harlem. That was intentional, because the most durable rules in history are not written by lawmakers. They are written by memory, by how people behave after something goes wrong, and how carefully they avoid letting it happen again. In Harlem, the story survived the way all real stories do. Not as a lesson, as a warning told sideways, a pause in conversation, a look exchanged when someone in uniform pushed too far. A reminder that power was never just about who held the keys, but about who kept the city running. Bumpy Johnson never spoke publicly about the incident, not once. No speech, no quote, no claim of credit. That silence became part of the legend. People noticed that after 1947, medical denials inside Harlem-connected facilities became rarer. Not non-existent, but rarer. In a system where even a 5% change could mean dozens of lives over a decade that mattered. The guard would continue working. He would age. He would tell the story differently in his own mind. Not as a mistake, but as a moment when he learned restraint too late. That is often how power remembers its losses. What lingered was not fear, it was caution. A folded newspaper left untouched, a coffee cup cooling on a table, a corridor where decisions were made more carefully than before. History often celebrates explosions, wars, riots, bloodshed. But the deeper transformations happen quietly when a community decides not to shout, not to strike, not to rush, when it chooses patience as a weapon and cooperation as leverage. This was not a story about revenge, it was a story about boundaries. About how public humiliation once witnessed cannot be undone, only answered. And about how the cost of disrespect is rarely paid by the person who commits it, but by the system that allows it. That is why this story was remembered, not because someone suffered, but because everyone learned.